Hello and welcome to this Aspiring Medics video where we talk about how I scored in the top percentile in my BMAT exam. My name is Antoni and I'm a fourth year medical student at the University of Oxford and I'm the BMAT course lead for the Aspiring Medics. In this video, we'll be going through the structure of the BMAT exam and some common misconceptions, but if you want to skip right past that and get onto my top 8 tips for the BMAT, go to this timestamp. These are the sort of tips which you can implement instantly into your practice to improve your score dramatically. Without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so let's talk about timings for section 1. The BMAT section 1 has 32 questions in 60 minutes, giving you just under 2 minutes per question. This means it sounds like a relatively large amount of time compared to the UCAT, but you really do have to watch for timings. Okay, and what sort of questions might you encounter in section 1? Well, they're divided into 2 types. First of all, we have problem-solving questions, and this is where you have to use lateral thinking to solve maths and logic-related puzzles. On the other hand, you can also have critical thinking questions, and these are where you are given a passage of text to analyze. This passage of text will contain some sort of argument, and you'll be asked to unpick different elements of the argument, including the conclusions, flaws, and the premises. It's really important that you work out which of these 2 types of question you are stronger at, and which you might require a bit more time for. This will help you plan your timings in the exam. And the final thing to touch on before we get onto my top tips is which universities actually use the BMAT. On the side of the screen here, you can see which universities use the BMAT, but it's really worth noting that not every university will use it in the same way. Some might include a strict cutoff, while others will use it with a lot less weighting. You can find more details on the Aspiring Medics website or the individual websites of each medical school. Okay, so now that we know a bit about the BMAT, why do students find section 1 so difficult? Well, the first reason is timings. The timings for the BMAT are very different from anything else you will have experienced before, and this is because the timings are a lot longer per question than the UCAT, but this actually doesn't necessarily leave enough time for the sort of lateral thinking and critical thinking that is required for many of the questions. This means that it can actually be really time pressured, especially since you probably haven't encountered questions like this before in your school career. The next reason why students tend to find section 1 difficult is because it involves a lot of new definitions. This is especially the case in critical thinking. So even common words like conclusion have a very specific meaning in BMAT section 1, and knowing exactly how we define these and what they mean is critical to being able to answer these questions accurately and quickly. The third reason why students find section 1 of the BMAT difficult is because of time drain questions. You might argue that this could happen in any exam, but BMAT section 1 is unique in the fact that it has problem-solving questions. These questions might be very tempting to spend a long time on because it feels like you've almost found the right answer, but knowing when to stop and move on to the next question is critical for making sure that you answer as many questions as you possibly can. And the final reason why students find section 1 difficult is overthinking. This is especially the case with critical thinking questions. Critical thinking questions are ones where you can read the passage many times and still not fully know what the conclusion or the argument being made really is. And as a result, it might be tempting to overthink the question and keep rereading the passage. This can once again lead to time drains. Okay, so moving on to some myth busting. The first myth we have is that in order to do well in the BMAT, you need to prep more than 3, 4, 5, or 6 months in advance. This is actually not the case. If you start preparing too early, you might risk burning out, meaning that you have no energy left to perform well in the actual exam. You'll start to hate the exam and will feel really overworked and not be able to perform at your very best. That's not to say that you don't need to give yourself enough time to be able to prep completely, but allowing yourself a good few weeks should be sufficient. The second myth we have is that there's no content to learn for section 1. So section 2 is classically known as the content-filled section because you might well have to revise a lot of your GCSE content. But in reality, there is still some content to learn for section 1. This is because critical thinking has some very particular definitions, and knowing how to define these and how to use these properly is critical to being able to score well in this section. The third myth we hear is that critical thinking in section 1 must be easy because all it does is ask you to find some definitions or some flaws. It is true that finding a conclusion sounds like a pretty simple task, but in reality the passages are written so that the different elements of the argument, such as the flaws, conclusions, and principles, are really woven into the text and hidden a little bit. So preparing well enough for critical thinking is key to doing well. And our final myth to bust, number 4, is that if I'm good or bad at the UCAT, I will also be good or bad at the BMAT. While the 2 exams are both used to get into medical school, the reality is that the type of exam is quite different, and there is not really a guarantee that your performance in the 2 exams will be related. Okay, so without further ado, let's get on to my top 8 tips for scoring well in BMAT section 1. My first tip is to have a set timing for each type of question in section 1. We've talked about how there are problem-solving questions and critical thinking questions in section 1, and you'll probably know after some time which one you are better at. But have you considered how much time you want to divide to each type of question? It might be worth starting in the exam with all of the questions that you know that you're stronger at, so that any time you have left over is left for the other type of question. Alternatively, you might allow yourself 2 minutes and 10 seconds for critical thinking questions, but only 1 minute and 40 seconds for problem-solving questions, if in your case problem-solving is stronger. Knowing how to divide your timings between the two question types can dramatically increase your score. Tip 2 is, for critical thinking questions, read the question, then the passage, and then the answers. The reason for this is that reading the question first allows you to find out what you're looking for in the passage. After this, you can of course look for that in the passage, and finally move on to the answers to see what matches most closely with what you've found. Reading the answer options last allows you to avoid any biases from reading the answer options and then applying them to the passage. Tip 3 relates to flaw questions in critical thinking. For these type of questions, it's worth watching lots of TV debates and reading lots of opinion pieces in different types of media. By consuming lots of different types of arguments in whatever form, you become better able to pick them apart and see what the problem is with them. In other words, recognizing flaws. So one way you might do this is by picking up your local newspaper and reading the opinions column. There's bound to be someone with some crazy opinion that they're trying to defend, and you might be able to spot some common flaws in their text. Tip 4 is to learn some mental math hacks for problem solving. Problem solving often involves maths questions with simple calculations, and having some hacks in your head for doing the maths can really save you a lot of time. So one example of this is, did you know that 16% of 50 is the same as 50% of 16? By flipping the percentages around, it allows a simpler calculation. Tip number 5 is to avoid problem solving questions when you're running low on time. And the reason for this is that problem solving questions tend to be the ones that are a time drain. At the very least, with critical thinking questions, you can usually make an educated guess about the answer once you've read the passage, or you might be able to eliminate a few of the answer options. With problem solving, often you might not even know how to start the problem if it's a particularly hard question. In that situation, I recommend focusing on the critical thinking questions. Tip number 6 is that problem solving questions can often be solved with elimination. So in their question, when you're asked to find, for example, a PIN code, you might be tempted to try and work out what the exact PIN code is, but you might simply be able to answer that question by eliminating each of the answer options that are not correct. This sort of thinking can be really useful for questions where there is a set of rules to be applied, and you can eliminate specific answer options based off these rules. Tip number 7 is to know exactly how you want to start off your Section 1 exam. Section 1 is the first part of the BMAT, meaning that your anxiety is going to be at its highest right at the start of the first section. This means that knowing how to kick off Section 1 can make a real difference to your score. A common trap that people fall into is being really determined to answer the first few questions. If you need to skip several of the first 5 or 10 questions, that is completely understandable and happens to a lot of people. If you become too focused on answering the first few questions and stubbornly not moving on, it can lead to problems with timing later on in the exam. Therefore, I recommend forming a strategy for how you're going to start your exam. This strategy might involve skipping any of the first questions that you find too difficult to know how to approach, or simply scanning the entire exam for an easier question that you know you can confidently attack to calm your nerves at the start of the paper. My final tip for Section 1 is to understand that Section 1 doesn't determine your whole performance. A really important skill is to be able to move on from Section 1 regardless of how you did in that section, and be able to focus on the other 2 sections with your full capacity. One thing that's always helped me is envisioning the exam before it happens. That doesn't just mean generally stressing about the fact it's going to happen, but actually walking through any sort of pathway in your head of what could happen. So how will you react if you do poorly in Section 1? How will you react if you do very well in Section 1? Having all of these ideas planned out in your head makes the day a bit less anxious and helps you focus on your remaining 2 sections. And that's the end of my top 8 tips for the BMAT Section 1. But if you want any more help with the BMAT, the Aspiring Medics are releasing a brand new BMAT course, all online, with plenty of interactive videos. The slides have been prepared by an expert creator, and I've done some recordings to explain the content on each slide. Feel free to check out the link in the description below to access this course. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.